The year is 1967. The city is Los Angeles. The venue is the Long Beach International Karate Championships, held at the Long Beach Arena. The narrator is a 71-year-old former sound technician named Gerald Okafor, working that night as a freelance audio contractor for the regional broadcast feed. The opponent is Mas Oyama's top American student, a 29-year-old Ohio-born full-contact fighter named Raymond Kowalski, 38 fights undefeated, Kyokushin style. The institution that suppressed this is a regional California sports broadcasting's syndicate that fed tape to 3 network affiliates. Suppression was ordered because the exchange embarrassed a sponsor and because one network executive decided the footage made their pre-show commentary look foolish. The physical evidence is a quarter-inch reel-to-reel audio tape Gerald, kept from the broadcast truck, still in its original cardboard sleeve, sitting in a fireproof document box under his workbench in Pasadena. My name is Gerald Okafor. I am 71 years old. I live in Pasadena, California, in the same house I have owned since 1984, and I have spent the last several months deciding whether to say what I am about to say. Not because I am afraid of anyone. I am past the age where fear of that particular kind means much to me. What made me hesitate was something simpler. I spent 34 years working in broadcast audio, and that profession, you learn very early that the people who talk too much about what they witnessed are not the people who get called back for the next job. You learn to be a reliable presence and a quiet one. You learn that your value to the people who hire you is partly your discretion. That discipline became a reflex, and a reflex held for 50-plus years does not release itself easily, even when the professional reason for it has long since expired. I retired in 2001. The last company that could have cared about my discretion was sold to a larger company in 2003, and that company no longer exists. There is no contract I signed that covers what I am about to describe. I checked. I had a lawyer check it too, 2 years ago, when I first started thinking seriously about this. There is nothing. The only thing that has kept me quiet this long is habit, and habit is not a good enough reason anymore. I was born in 1953 in Inglewood, California. My father worked maintenance at Hughes Aircraft. My mother taught 3rd grade at a public school in Hawthorne. I was the second of 4 children. I grew up in a house where the television was on most evenings and where the radio was on most mornings, and I developed an early and specific obsession, not with what came out of those boxes, but with how it got there. I was the kind of child who wanted to take things apart. By the time I was 14, I had disassembled and partially reassembled 2 radios and 1 television set, and my father, rather than being angry about it, enrolled me in an electronics course at the community center in Inglewood that was run on Saturday mornings by a retired Navy radio operator named Earl Hutchins. Earl was the most technically precise person I had met in my young life. He taught me that precision was not the enemy of speed, it was the condition for it. That lesson has stayed with me longer than most things. I did not go to a 4-year college. I went to a technical program, got my FCC license, and by 1971 I was working as a third audio on a local Los Angeles television crew. By 1975, I was running my own small freelance operation out of a van I had converted into a mobile audio production unit. I worked sports broadcasts, local news feeds, corporate events, anything that needed clean sound captured and delivered on time. I was good at it. I worked clean and fast, and I did not create problems for the people above me, which in that era in Los Angeles television was the quality that kept you employed more reliably than almost any technical skill. I got the call for the Long Beach International Karate Championships in the spring of 1967. I was 23 years old at the time. I had been hired as a freelance audio contractor by a man named Dennis Pryor, who was producing a regional sports package for a California broadcast syndicate that fed content to 3 network affiliates in the western United States. Dennis was a solid producer, organized, not particularly warm but fair, and he had used me on 2 prior jobs. The job was a 2-day shoot. I was responsible for the broadcast truck audio chain, which meant I was physically stationed in the truck for most of the event, but my role also required me to run cable checks inside the venue before and during the event, which meant I was physically present inside the Long Beach Arena at various points throughout both days. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I was not watching from a monitor in a truck. I was inside the building at various distances during what I am about to describe. The event itself was legitimate. The Long Beach Championships in that period were among the most serious competitive karate events in the Western United States. Ed Parker organized them. The competitors who came through that venue were not performing. They were fighting. The audience understood the difference, and the atmosphere reflected it. This was not a demonstration. This was a competitive event with judges and brackets and real stakes, and it also had, as part of its programming, a demonstration segment in which invited practitioners could show specific techniques or engage in arranged exhibition matches. What happened in that demonstration segment on the afternoon of the second day is what I am here to describe. The recording that was made of that afternoon went into the broadcast package that Dennis Pryor assembled. The East Coast feed went out on a Tuesday evening through one of the 3 affiliates. I have reason to believe approximately 40,000 people watched it live in that broadcast window. Tape was pulled from the archive within 72 hours. The official internal record for why it was pulled uses the phrase, "production decision." I was not in the meeting where that decision was made, but I was close enough to the conversation in the corridor outside the production office to hear what was actually said, and I will tell you what I heard. No one has ever been able to force me to be silent about this. The reason I was silent is that I was a working man with a family and a mortgage and a freelance business that depended on referrals from the same people who made that decision. That reason is no longer relevant. I am 71 years old. My wife Darlene passed in 2019. My daughter lives in Portland, and my son lives in Atlanta, and neither of them is in the broadcast business. I have nothing left to protect except the accuracy of what I know I saw, and that is the thing I have decided to stop protecting by keeping it to myself. The Long Beach Arena in 1967 was not a glamorous building. It sat on the edge of the Harbor District. A squat concrete structure that looked from the outside like a warehouse that had been told to stand up straight. The exterior walls were painted a municipal gray that had been weathering for at least a decade, and the paint had developed that particular texture that concrete takes on when it has been rained on and dried out many times without being repainted. A kind of granular roughness you could feel if you ran your palm across it. There were American flags flanking the main entrance and a banner strung across the facade that read Long Beach International Karate Championships in block letters on a white background, and the banner was large enough to read from across the parking lot, but not large enough to fill the space it was hung in, so it looked slightly undersized, which gave the whole entrance a quality that was professional but not lavish. The parking lot was asphalt, and it had been hot that week, and when you stepped onto it in the afternoon, the heat came up through the soles of your shoes. There were maybe 200 cars in the lot by early afternoon on the second day, and by the time I finished my cable check inside and walked back out to the truck around 1 in the afternoon, the lot was considerably fuller. People were coming from a wide area. I heard accents from the Midwest and from the South, and I heard languages I could not identify. And this was before the demographics of Los Angeles had shifted as dramatically as they would by the 1980s. The event drew people from the martial arts community who followed these things closely. And they came from distance. Inside, the building smelled like old concrete and cleaning product, and, underneath those, something older and harder to name, the particular smell of a building that has absorbed years of crowd events. The aggregated presence of large numbers of people over time. The ventilation system was audible at low volume throughout the building. A steady low, every blossom, that never quite became sound because it quite became background noise, because it shifted slightly in pitch depending on where you were standing and how the ducks above you were arranged. The main floor had been laid with competition mats in the center, and the mats were that dense foam construction covered in canvas that was standard for that period, and they had been used enough that the surfaces had a slight give that was different from new mats. The lighting was primarily overhead fluorescent, the long tube kind mounted in industrial housings, and the light they produced was cool and slightly bluish and fell unevenly across the floor because some of the tubes were older than others and burned at slightly different intensities. Along the perimeter of the main floor, there were folding chairs set up in sections, and by early afternoon most of them were occupied, and the crowd noise was a steady ambient murmur that rose and fell without any particular rhythm. People finding their seats, talking to the people next to them, specific conversational warmth of a crowd that has gathered around a shared interest and is relaxed in that interest. The competition mats in the center were set at a slight remove from the first row of seats, maybe 8 feet of open floor between the edge of the mat and the nearest chair. That open corridor ran all the way around the mat area and was used by officials and by people like me who needed to move through the space without crossing in front of spectators. A cable run for the floor microphones took me along that corridor twice during the afternoon. I knew the route well by the second day. I could move through it without looking at my feet, which meant I could look at the mat, and I did. Raymond Kowalski arrived at the venue at approximately 11 in the morning on the second day. I know this because I was coming out of the venue after my first cable check of the morning, when he came through the main entrance, and I held the door for him without knowing who he was, and he thanked me in a way that suggested he was a person who was accustomed to moving through spaces where people did not hold doors for him. He was a large man, not in the exaggerated sense that word sometimes implies, but in the functional sense. He was 6 feet and perhaps 1 inch tall, and his weight I estimated at around 210 pounds, and none of that weight was decorative. He moved with the particular compactness that very strong people sometimes develop, a way of occupying space that is efficient rather than expansive. His hands were remarkable. I noticed them because my job involves noticing things, and the hands of someone who has done serious, full contact work for years have a quality that is different from ordinary hands. The knuckles thickened, the skin across the back of the hand having a density that speaks to sustained impact. His were like that. Working hands in the most literal sense. Raymond Kowalski was 29 years old at the time of this event. He had been training in Kyokushin karate since the age of 15, which at that point was 14 years of practice, and he had been competing seriously since he was 22. His record in sanctioned full-contact competition at the time of this event was 38 fights, no losses. That number needs context. Kyokushin competition in that era was not sport karate. There were no points for near-contact techniques. You landed or you did not, and if you landed enough and your opponent could not continue, that was the resolution. Kowalski's 38 fights had produced 22 stoppages. The other 16 were decisions, but from what people who had been present for those fights told me later, the decisions were not close decisions. He had fought in Ohio, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and twice in Japan, where he had been brought over as part of an exchange program organized by Mas Oyama's organization. He had won both fights in Japan. In Japan, this was considered significant. His style was built on 3 foundations. The first was the low kick, specifically the outside low kick targeting the lateral aspect of the thigh above the knee. In Kyokushin competition of that era, this was the signature weapon, and Kowalski had developed his to a degree that people who talked about it used the word structural, not painful. Structural. He had ended fights with low kicks, not because they hurt badly enough to stop someone, but because they had progressively removed the opponent's ability to put weight on one side of their body. The second foundation was his close-range elbow work, which he had developed beyond the standard curriculum and which he threw with a horizontal arc that was unusual for the style. The third was his patience. He was a man who had learned to wait. People who had fought him described a quality in his movement that felt like waiting, even when he was advancing, as though each step forward was also a form of holding still, of conserving something for a moment that had not yet arrived. He had been told, I learned later, that he was being invited to participate in a demonstration segment at the championships. He had been told the format was a general exhibition of his style's techniques, followed by a brief arranged exchange with a practitioner of a different style. He had been told the other practitioner was a martial artist and actor named Bruce Lee. He knew who Bruce Lee was from television. The Green Hornet had been airing for about a year at that point, and Bruce Lee, as Kato, had been noticed by people in the martial arts community in a way that was somewhat different from how a general audience noticed him. The community watched Kato's movement with professional attention, and the assessment in that community was split. Some people said he was remarkable, that there was something in his movement that was real and not performed. Other people said he was an actor and a demonstrator, and that there was no way to know, without a real test, what any of it meant. Kowalski had said he did not know. He had said that honestly to the person who invited him. He genuinely did not know, and he was curious in the way that a serious practitioner is curious, with a carefulness that is adjacent to respect. What he had not been told was the format of the exchange in any specific detail. He had not been told how long it would run. He had not been told whether it was cooperative or competitive. He had assumed cooperative and had prepared for cooperative, and he had also prepared for the possibility that it was not, because he was the kind of man who prepared for the possibility that things were not what they had been described as. That quality was part of his record, Ftensisen. He found a seat in the secondary area near the wall and sat with his bag at his feet and watched the morning competition with a quality of attention that I noticed when I passed him during my second cable check. He was not watching casually. He was watching the way someone watches when they are filing information. His eyes moved with each exchange on the mat, tracking weight shifts, tracking how people use their hands before they committed. He did not look tense. He looked gathered. Bruce Lee arrived at the Long Beach Arena at approximately 12:45 in the afternoon. I know the time because I was in the broadcast truck doing a pre-show systems check, and I noted his arrival in the log I kept for each job, a personal habit from my early training with Earl Hutchins, who had insisted that a good audio technician kept a time-stamped log throughout any broadcast day. The log entry reads, BL arrives East Entrance, 12:47. That log still exists. It is in the same box as the tape. He came through the East Entrance rather than the main entrance. The East Entrance was the one used by staff and crew, not spectators, and I do not know whether he was directed there or chose it himself, but it was the less visible entrance, and he used it without any apparent self-consciousness. He was alone. No manager, no assistant, no publicist, no one carrying anything for him. He had a small canvas bag over one shoulder, the kind of bag a person carries when they have packed light and deliberately. He was wearing dark trousers and a plain dark jacket over what appeared to be a light-colored shirt, and the clothing was clean and unremarkable and did not announce anything. He was 26 years old. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall, and in the vicinity of 135 pounds. In that building, among the people gathered for a serious martial arts event, he was easy to overlook at first glance. He was not the largest person in the room. He was not the loudest presence. He walked from the east entrance toward the preparation area near the south end of the floor, with a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, and the quality of his movement, even at that walking pace, was the thing that caught your attention once you had noticed him. He walked the way. Someone walks when they are not performing walking. Each step was placed, not landed. The word that came to me then, and that I have used in the years since, when I have described him privately to people I trust is calibrated. Everything was calibrated. I watched him from inside the venue during one of my cable route passes. He had found a chair in the preparation area, and he sat with his bag on the floor beside him, and his hands folded in his lap, and he watched the mat, not with Kowalski's filing quality, something different. He was still in a way that required attention to notice. His eyes were open and moving and present, but the rest of him had a quality of having arrived and settled, of having arranged itself for what was coming, without tension and without performance. He sat there for perhaps 20 minutes before anyone approached him. During those 20 minutes, as far as I could observe, during my 2 passes through the area, no one spoke to him and he spoke to no one, and he appeared to find this neither uncomfortable nor notable. I want to be careful about what I claim to know and what I claim to have observed. I was 23 years old. I was doing my job. I was not standing in front of Bruce Lee studying him. What I am describing is what I registered from a moving position during cable checks. What I registered was enough that I have thought about it regularly for 58 years, and I believe I am describing it accurately. The program on the second afternoon ran through the competition finals in the late morning and into early afternoon, and the demonstration segment was scheduled to begin at approximately 2 o'clock. The host for the demonstration segment was a man named Carl Schaefer, who was one of Ed Parker's associates and who handled the presentation work at these events with a competence that was neither exciting nor problematic. He had a wireless microphone, which was part of my responsibility, and I had done the mic check with him during the morning, and the mic was clean. Also present for the demonstration segment was a woman I will call Ingrid Larson, because that is not her name, and she asked me, in a conversation some years later, not to use her real name if I ever told this story. She was Swedish, 32 years old in 1967, every vine, every blossom, a journalist covering martial arts for a Scandinavian sports publication that had a significant international readership in the martial arts world. She had been credentialed for the event through the press section and had been present for both days of competition. She spoke English with fluency and precision, the kind of precision that sometimes comes from learning a language as an adult through formal study rather than immersion, every word chosen rather than habitual. She also spoke, I learned later, Japanese, to be functional in a conversation, which mattered because it meant she did not need a full interpreter for everything, only for the formal portions. There was also a translator present, whose name I do not know. He was a young Japanese-American man, perhaps 24 or 25, who had been brought in by the event organization for the demonstration segment. He sat at a small table to the side of the demonstration area, and his role was to translate for any exchanges that required it, primarily anything directed at the audience and anything that needed precision across languages. His presence was professional and his work during the segment was accurate and fast, from what I could judge. Carl Schaefer introduced the demonstration segment to the audience at approximately 2:15, running slightly behind schedule because of an overtime finish in the last competition final. He introduced Raymond Kowalski first, and Kowalski walked to the center of the mat from the south preparation area and stood there with a quality of relaxed readiness that I had also noted when I passed him earlier. The audience received him with genuine appreciation. People who understood what his record represented responded to his presence accordingly. He bowed to the audience, and the bow was neither deep nor shallow, and it was offered once and meant. Then Schaefer introduced Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee walked from the east side of the floor to the center of the mat, and the audience response was larger, which was simply a function of his visibility from television, rather than any informed assessment of his skill at that point. He was known, Kowalski was respected by the people who followed the sport. But Bruce Lee was known by a broader audience, and that audience was in the room. Bruce took his position on the mat at a distance from Kowalski. That was roughly 10 feet, and they faced each other, And Schaefer offered a brief description of both practitioners for the audience, and then Schaefer stepped back, said that before the physical portion of the demonstration, he would open the floor for a brief exchange of conversation that had been agreed upon in advance, that Ingrid Larsen had requested this as part of her publication's coverage, and that a translator was present. The conversation that followed lasted, by my best recollection, somewhere between 22 and 26 minutes. I was inside the venue for the first 11 minutes, having completed my cable route, before I needed to return to the truck for a monitor check. When I returned to the inside of the building, approximately 8 minutes later, the conversation was still continuing. I am describing what I heard across both of those periods, and I am describing it as accurately as I can, while acknowledging that some of what I am reconstructing is from memory of specific phrases I retained, and some is from the surrounding context those phrases created. Ingrid Larsen opened by addressing both men together. She said, through the translator for the benefit of anyone who needed it, but primarily in direct English to both of them, that she was interested in a specific question that had been debated in the martial arts press for several years, which was whether systems of fighting that had been developed before the 20th century retained practical validity against a fully trained modern athlete who had access to cross-training and who understood fighting through competition rather than through tradition. She said this was not a hostile question but an honest one, and that she was asking it of both of them and would appreciate a direct answer from each. Kowalski responded first. He said, with a directness that I found genuinely admirable, that he thought tradition without testing was sentiment and not skill. He said, the reason he trained in Kyokushin was not because of its history but because its full contact rules had produced the most accurate test of the techniques he had spent his life learning. He said, any system that refused full contact testing was protecting its techniques from the only evidence that mattered. He said this without hostility and without looking at Bruce Lee when he said it, though he was clearly aware that the remark had implications for the conversation. The translator rendered this for the portion of the audience that needed it, and then looked at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone preparing a performance. The silence of someone who was thinking and did not feel the need to pretend otherwise. Then he said that he agreed with Kowalski, more than Kowalski probably expected, and that his own view was that any system which prevented you from discovering its weaknesses was not teaching you to fight, but teaching you to believe in something, he said. He had spent a significant portion of the last several years removing from his practice everything he had been taught that he could not demonstrate was functional under pressure. He said this had left him with considerably less than he had started with, which he considered progress. There was a small laugh from the audience at this, and Bruce Lee's expression during that laugh was not a performer's expression. He was not playing to it. He simply waited for it to finish. Ingrid Larsen then asked a more specific question. She addressed it to Bruce Lee. She said, you move in a way that is different from what is taught in any specific tradition I have observed. And I have observed many in the course of this work. And I am wondering whether what you do can be transmitted to another person, or whether it is something that only functions because of the specific physical attributes you possess. It was a careful question, honest in a way that carried some weight of potential challenge, without being designed to provoke. She was doing journalism, not for performance. Bruce Lee looked at her for a moment, and then said, that is the most useful question anyone has asked me in about 3 years. He said that the honest answer was that he did not know with certainty that the work of identifying what was principle versus what was personal attribute was ongoing, and he did not think he had finished it. He said the part he was most confident could be taught was the part about absence, about learning to not be where a technique was going to arrive, and that this was teachable, but required a kind of mental restructuring that most training systems did not prepare people for. because most training systems were organized around what to do rather than around where not to be. He said that sounded like a riddle, and he did not mean it that way. He said if you watch a good fighter lose, which he had done carefully many times, what you nearly always see is not that their technique was bad, but that they were where the technique arrived. The technique could be blocked, or it could be avoided. Avoidance was invisible. Blocking was not. He said he had chosen invisibility as his primary direction, and that this choice had costs as well as benefits which he was still sorting out. Kowalski had been listening to this with the same quality of attention I had noticed when he was watching the morning competition, that filing quality, precise and patient. He spoke then, not through the translator, but in the direct conversational English he had been using throughout. He said, "I have been told that you strike with a 1-inch distance and produce significant force. I have also been told this was demonstrated under controlled conditions with a chosen partner." He paused. He said, "I do not believe controlled demonstrations tell us what we need to know. The gap between what is possible in a controlled demonstration and what functions in a full contact exchange has ended the careers of a great many practitioners I have known personally." He said this without aggression, with the quality of someone stating a position they held, with evidence and without apology. The room had changed by this point. The ambient conversational murmur had stopped. The ventilation was audible. Crowd was present in the focused way that a crowd becomes present when it understands that what is happening in front of it is real. Bruce Lee said, "You are right about demonstrations." Then he said, "The only way to answer your question is to not answer it." He said it without drama, and it took a moment for the room to understand what he meant. But Kowalski understood it immediately. I could see this in his face from where I was standing along the corridor. Something settled in his expression that I can only describe as readiness, not excitement, not nervousness, but the settling of someone who has been waiting for the answer to a question and has received it. Schaefer moved toward the center of the mat and said a few words about the exhibition format, that both practitioners had agreed to a free exchange within certain parameters, that the translator was available, that the audience should remain seated. These few words were the formal container for what was about to happen, and everyone in the room knew that the container was a formality. They faced each other on the mat at a distance I estimated from my position along the south corridor, at approximately 12 feet. Kowalski stood in his fighting position, which was a mid-stance, with the right side slightly forward, hands carried at mid-chest height, the classic Kyokushin guard appropriate for the low-kick-oriented approach he was known for. His weight was slightly back on his left side, which was a preparation for the forward drive of the right side low kick. This is observable if you know what you are looking at. I was looking at it, and I had been told by the audio crew on a prior job what Kyokushin footwork looked like, which was enough that I could see the preparation. Bruce Lee stood in what I can only describe as the absence of a stance. He was on the mat with his feet at a width that was natural, not ceremonial. His hands were low, lower than a conventional guard, hanging rather than raised. His head was level. He was looking at Kowalski not from a guard position, but from a standing position that contained the guard invisibly, and if you did not know what you were looking at, he appeared simply to be standing there. Kowalski moved first. The first technique was a probing movement, a partial step forward with the left foot, followed by a very quick low feint with the right shoulder, not a committed technique but a test, the kind of opening movement that experienced fighters use to read distance and reaction. The feint covered perhaps 18 inches of forward distance before Kowalski arrested it. During that 18 inches of movement, Bruce Lee had shifted his weight backward by approximately 6 inches, not more, not a full retreat, a minimal repositioning that maintained every option while removing the target. The shift was so small that several people near me in the corridor made no response to it. They were waiting for the exchange to begin, and did not recognize that it already had. Kowalski took the information from that probe and was still for a full 2 seconds. I counted them. He was reading what he had learned, which was that the distance management Bruce Lee was operating was extremely fine, finer than most people he had encountered, and that the response had been automatic rather than deliberate. The way a trained response is automatic, which is different from a rehearsed response. He processed this. Then he moved. The outside low kick Kowalski threw next was committed. It was not a feint. His left foot stepped to the outside of the line, and his right hip loaded, and the kick came from the hip with the full rotation of the Kyokushin delivery, the shin targeting the outside of the left thigh at the midpoint. The kick traveled in an arc of perhaps half a second from full load to intended target. From my position along the corridor, I watched the entire arc. The kick completed its arc in the space where Bruce Lee had been. By the time the shin arrived at the target coordinate, the left thigh was not there. Bruce Lee had shifted off the line to his right, with a step that was not back but diagonal, a movement that relocated him approximately 30 degrees out of the arc's path. And the kick completed itself in empty air with a sound, a real sound, the sound of the shin moving through air at speed, a dry compression, brief and precise. And then Kowalski's planted foot absorbed the kick's return force and he was back in his stance. And Bruce Lee was standing 30 degrees to where he had been with his hands still low. The crowd registered this, not loudly, not with applause, but with a quality of sound that crowds make when they have seen something they did not expect, an inhalation, held briefly, and released as a kind of collective exhale, a sound that is not quite sound, more like the room itself adjusting. Kowalski adjusted too. He stepped back by half a step and reset his weight, and looked at the space where the kick had arrived. Then he looked at Bruce Lee. His expression was not frustrated. It was the expression of someone who has received information and is categorizing it. The next exchange happened faster. Kowalski threw a combination, left jab to the face to bring the hands up, following immediately with the outside low kick from the right side. The jab was not a hard punch. It was a placement device, the standard Kyokushin combination, and it worked as a placement device, because Bruce Lee's hands did come up slightly in response to the jab. The low kick came. This time the kick found partial contact. Bruce Lee had begun the lateral movement before the kick completed, but the timing was narrower than the first exchange, and the shin found the outside of the calf, rather than the thigh, lower and with less force than intended, but contact. Real contact. The sound was different from the air compression of the first kick. Softer but present. Bruce Lee's foot moved under the impact, a small displacement, fafult. And he took one small step to recover the balance that the partial impact had disturbed. I want to be precise about this moment, because it is the moment that makes everything else in what I am describing mean what it means. He was touched. It was not a serious hit. It was a partial connection with a powerful technique that landed lower and later than intended. But it happened, and his foot moved under it, and he needed one step to rebalance. From my position along the corridor, approximately 35 feet from the center of the mat, I saw this clearly. I have said to people privately in the years since that this was the moment I understood I was watching something real and not a demonstration, because demonstrations do not include that moment. Demonstrations are clean. That moment was not clean. After the small rebalancing step, Bruce Lee's hands came down to their low position again. He looked at Kowalski. Something in his face had shifted by a degree I could register but not name exactly. Not anger, not alarm. Something adjacent to focus. The settled quality of someone who has received new information and has incorporated it. Then he moved forward. The distance closed to roughly 6 feet. In a single step that was not a lunge but a glide. A horizontal transfer of weight that produced forward movement without the telegraphing that a conventional step produces. Kowalski read the entry and shifted his weight back slightly, preparing for the incoming pressure. And as Kowalski's weight moved back, Bruce Lee's lead hand extended not as a punch but as a check, making contact with the front of Kowalski's guard. Light contact. That was not the strike, but the measure. And in the fraction of a second that the check hand was in contact with Kowalski's guard, Bruce Lee's rear hand was already loading. The 1-inch punch, or whatever the accurate technical name for what he threw is, I do not know the precise terminology, arrived from a distance of perhaps 4 inches of draw, and produced a result that I can only describe in mechanical terms. Kowalski's center mass moved backward, not dramatically, not a launching back through the air, result that demonstrations produce for audiences on padded assistants. A specific, sharp displacement of approximately 18 inches, his heels leaving the mat for a half second, his body registering the impact in its center before his guard could receive it, because the technique had gone through the guard, along the inside line of his arm, and arrived at the sternum area with a concentrated force that was clearly more than the preparation had suggested was coming. Kowalski's feet landed back on the mat. He took one step back to finish recovering his balance. He put his hand on the front of his chest, the area of impact. Not in pain, in assessment. He pressed his fingers against the sternum briefly. Then he looked at Bruce Lee with an expression I have carried with me for 58 years. It was not defeat. It was not embarrassment. It was the expression of a very serious person who has encountered something that does not fit any category they have previously established, who is now rebuilding a category in real time, and who finds the process of rebuilding the category interesting rather than threatening. He took a breath. He stood up straight. He looked down at his own forearms, where the guard that had not protected him was still positioned. He looked back up. Bruce Lee was 3 feet away from him, in the same low-handed standing position, watching him without expression. Not triumph, not assessment. Watching, Kowalski began to move again, and the second round of the exchange was different in character from the first. He was no longer testing. He was engaging, which is not the same thing. He threw a stepping reverse punch from the right side, committed, targeting the solar plexus, and the punch was a real punch, not a demonstration technique, and Bruce Lee was not where it was going. The evasion was a shoulder-level drop of perhaps 3 inches, combined with a sideways shift, and the punch passed through the space where the solar plexus had been, and continued through the air, and as it extended through its completion, Bruce Lee's rear elbow was already moving on the horizontal arc, not at Kowalski's head, but at his lead arm. A precise targeting of the bicep at the extended position of the punch. Contact was light, but the point was made. The arm was open. The arm was open, and the elbow had been at the bicep, and the next time through that arm would be a real strike at a real target. Kowalski reset. He was breathing now. Not hard, but the breath was audible to me from the corridor, which told me he was working at a real level. He shifted his feet and set for the clinch attempt, a forward pressure movement, with both arms seeking the inside tie, the kind of movement that takes the exchange to the ground, or to close range where Kyokushin's elbow work comes alive. He moved forward into it, and Bruce Lee allowed the distance to close to 4 feet, 3 feet, and at 2.5 feet he moved. Not back, sideways and through, a movement that relocated him behind Kowalski's right shoulder faster than I could process it. Not because it was too fast to see, but because the route it took was unexpected, and what happened in the next half second was a palm check to the back of the right shoulder, light, precise, redirectional, and Kowalski's forward momentum continued without the target in front of it, carrying him 1 step further forward before he arrested it. And Bruce Lee was behind him at 3 feet, and his hands were in their low position, and he was standing there. Kowalski stopped. He did not turn quickly. He turned slowly, deliberately, and when he was facing Bruce Lee again, his face had done something I can only describe as relaxing, not defeat. Relief. The relief of a person who has been genuinely uncertain about something for years and has now received an answer that they can accept as real. He stood up out of his fighting stance, fully upright. He looked at Bruce Lee for a moment, and then he raised his right hand, open, palm forward, The gesture that across most combat disciplines means, "This is what I mean. This is my acknowledgement," offered without the performative quality of the media submission gesture. He held it for a moment. Bruce Lee looked at it. Then he raised his left hand in the same gesture, briefly. Then he walked toward Kowalski and extended his right hand. Kowalski shook it. The room took approximately 3 seconds to begin applauding, which in my experience is the time it takes a crowd to finish processing something and begin expressing it. When the applause came, it started in the middle left section of the seats, from the people who, I could see, had been watching with the most attention throughout. The people in the room who understood what they had seen, and then it spread outward through the room in a wave that took perhaps 8 seconds to reach its full volume. Then it sustained for a time that I did not count, but that was long. Carl Schaefer said something into his microphone that I could not hear from my position. The translator said something. Then Schaefer invited both men to sit on the chairs that had been set up at the edge of the mat, and Ingrid Larsson joined them, and the translator took his position, and what followed was a conversation that lasted approximately 18 minutes that I was able to observe for about 11 of them, before I had to return to the truck. Kowalski spoke first once they were seated. He addressed Bruce Lee directly and he said, "The thing you did with my arm when I extended the reverse punch, the elbow placement," he said. He had never encountered that as a response to that technique, and he wanted to understand the principle. Bruce Lee said the principle was not complicated, but it required accepting a premise that most training resisted, which was that contact made during an opponent's extension was not a block but an invitation. He said when the arm was fully extended, it was no longer a weapon, it was a lever, and the question was whether you were close enough and angled correctly to use it as one. Kowalski considered this. He said, "In Kyokushin, we do not work that range. We work below the elbow from outside, or above the elbow from inside." Bruce Lee said, "I know. That is what I was looking for." There was something in the way he said this that was not boastful. He had looked for something that was available and he had found it. He was stating a fact. Ingrid Larsson asked Kowalski whether this changed his understanding of the exchange that had preceded it, the earlier conversation about tested validity versus tradition. Kowalski looked at her and said, "I came here with a question." He paused. He said, "I have an answer." He said the answer was not what he had expected it to be, which did not mean he had been wrong to hold the question, because you could only get an answer like this by holding the question seriously. He said he would think about what he had just learned for a long time. He said this with the matter-of-fact quality of a person stating a professional assessment. No performance. Larsson nodded and wrote something. The audience was quiet during this conversation in the way that audiences are quiet when they are listening to something they did not expect to be interesting and have discovered is the most interesting thing in the room. The show ended about 40 minutes after the exchange. By this point, I had completed my post-show systems shutdown in the truck and come back inside to collect the floor microphones and run my cables out. The audience was clearing. The floor was in the slow process of being disassembled by the event crew. There were knots of people in conversation near the seating sections and near the exits. The ventilation, which I had registered as background through the entire afternoon, had become the primary sound in the room as the crowd thinned, and the fluorescent light, which had seemed even during the event, revealed itself in the emptying room as slightly uneven along the east wall, where 2 of the tubes were darker than the others. I was coiling a floor mic cable along the south corridor when I saw Kowalski sitting alone in a folding chair near the mat. Not in distress, not brooding, sitting with his bag at his feet and his hands in his lap in a posture that was similar to the posture I had seen Bruce Lee sitting in that morning. And I do not know whether this similarity was meaningful or coincidental. He was looking at the mat. Then he looked at his right hand, which he opened and closed once, slowly, and then put back in his lap. About 20 minutes after the show ended, I was moving through the east corridor with my cable bag, heading for the exit when I saw them. Kowalski had come out of the main floor through a side door, and Bruce Lee was approximately 10 feet ahead of him in the same corridor, heading for the east entrance, and there was no one else in that corridor at that moment. Except me, approximately 40 feet behind them, with a cable bag on my shoulder, walking slowly enough that I had time to observe the moment before I reached it. Kowalski said something. I heard it clearly, and I heard it in Swedish, which I do not speak, so what I heard was the sound of the words rather than their meaning. 6 words, something like that, said at a normal conversational volume and tone. Not a shout, not a whisper, the tone of someone completing a thought they had been carrying since earlier, and had decided to complete. Bruce Lee was about 8 feet ahead of him, and slightly turned away. He slowed and turned slightly and said, in English, and I heard this clearly, "That's about right." Then he kept walking. Kowalski stopped walking. He was standing in the middle of the corridor in the fluorescent light, with the cable lockers on one side and the wall on the other, and his face did something that I registered as a person understanding something fully, not for the first time, but completely for the first time. And then he laughed. A real laugh, brief, surprised by itself, the kind of laugh that comes out of a person who was not planning to laugh. Bruce Lee went through the east entrance door, and the door closed behind him, and the sound of it closing was a concrete echo that dissipated in the corridor. And then there was the ventilation sound again, and the distant outside traffic. I passed Kowalski without saying anything, because there was nothing to say, and he was not looking for conversation, and I went through the door into the parking lot, and the heat was already cooling toward evening, and the lot was mostly empty, and there was the harbor smell in the air, salt and diesel, and the lights over the parking lot were beginning to be visible against the sky. I was in the broadcast truck, finishing the last of my shutdown inventory, when I heard the conversation that I have thought about ever since. The truck was parked adjacent to the venue building on the east side, and the production office was a temporary space they had set up in a loading corridor near the east entrance, and the wall between the truck and that corridor was not thick. Voices carried. The conversation I am about to describe came to me through that wall clearly enough that I have never doubted what was said. The 2 voices were Dennis Pryor and a man named Arthur Whitfield. I knew Arthur Whitfield because he had been present on 2 prior broadcasts. I had worked through the same syndicate, and he was the standards representative for the syndicate's relationship with the largest of the 3 affiliates. He was the person who made decisions about what went into the broadcast package and what did not. What I heard went approximately as follows. Pryor said that the exchange was the best material in the package, and that the affiliate audience response on the East Coast feed had been significant, that the switchboard had received calls, not complaints but calls of interest, people asking when it would air again. Whitfield said he had seen the segment, and that his concern was the pre-show commentary. The pre-show commentary had included a segment in which 2 martial arts commentators on the affiliated channel had, about 3 days before the event, discussed Bruce Lee's background and offered the opinion that his television work was interesting, but that his competitive credibility relative to full contact practitioners was an open question. This commentary had aired. It was on tape. Whitfield said that the exchange segment alongside that commentary created what he called an editorial imbalance that the affiliate was not comfortable with. Pryor said that was not an editorial imbalance, but an accurate record of what had happened at the event. Whitfield said that was a matter of perspective. Pryor said it was not. Whitfield said the decision had already been made. Then Whitfield said, "Log it as a production decision and pull it from the West Coast schedule." Pryor said something I could not fully hear. Then he said the East Coast already ran it. Whitfield said, "Yes." Then there was a sound of movement. Someone picking something up. Footsteps. The door at the end of the corridor opening and closing, The East Coast feed had run the segment. Approximately 40,000 viewers in the eastern United States had seen it. No West Coast affiliate ran it. The tape was logged as a production decision, which is the phrase that means someone decided something and did not want to explain further. I looked for that tape in the archive the following week, under the pretext of a post-production audio check. The sleeve was in the box, but the reel was gone, replaced with a blank. The blank had a small piece of masking tape on it with Dennis Pryor's initials and the date. I do not know what that means specifically. I know what it suggests. I kept my log from that day. I kept it because I keep logs from every job, a habit from Earl Hutchins that has never left me. On a Tuesday about 3 days after the event, I was reviewing the log as part of my post-job bookkeeping, and I made a copy of the relevant page and put it in a file. That file went into a box that I have carried with me through every move since 1967, 3 different houses in the Los Angeles area. In the same box, there is the quarter-inch reel-to-reel audio tape from the broadcast truck feed from the afternoon of the second day, which I retained because my cable check protocol required me to make a scratch reference recording at the truck before going inside, and that recording captured the full audio of the demonstration segment through the floor microphones I had positioned. The tape is in its original cardboard sleeve, white with a handwritten label in black grease pencil that reads LB Championships, Day 2 p.m. Demo, and underneath that the date and my crew initials. The cardboard is brown at the corners from age. The reel inside is in good condition, as far as I can tell, without playing it, and I have not played it in years because I no longer have a machine that can play it cleanly, and I do not want to damage it. The box sits on the lower shelf of the workbench in my garage in Pasadena. It is a gray metal fireproof document box, the kind with the snap closure, and it is next to a coffee can that holds soldering wire and an old circuit board I have been meaning to throw away for approximately 10 years. On top of the box, there is a small tray that holds drill bits. The box has been in various versions of that position, on a workbench in a garage for 58 years. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. He died in Hong Kong from a cerebral edema. He was 6 years past the afternoon in Long Beach. He was in the middle of what was clearly going to be a career that had not yet become what it was becoming. I heard the news on the radio, in the truck on the way to a job in the valley, and I pulled over on the shoulder of the freeway and sat there for about 5 minutes before I continued. I was 20 years old when I met him, in the sense that I was in a room with him. I was 29 when he died. The 6 years between those two dates contained a lot of what I understand about what is possible in a human body and a human mind. And the source of most of that understanding is that afternoon. Raymond Kowalski continued competing for another 4 years after the Long Beach event. His record when he retired from competition in 1971 was 46 fights, 43 wins, 2 losses, 1 draw. He opened a school in Columbus, Ohio in 1972 that I believe is still operating under someone else's instruction. He taught Kyokushin for decades. I have never been able to confirm whether he spoke about the Long Beach exchange publicly. I tried once in the 1980s to find a contact for him and was unable to. If he is alive, he is in his late 80s. I hope he is alive. Ingrid Larsson's article ran in her publication in 1967. I read a translation of it some years later. She described the exchange. She described it accurately. The article circulated in the martial arts press in Europe for some time. It did not circulate in the United States, because the publication did not have an American distribution deal. And this was before the age when international press could cross oceans in seconds. I do not know how many people read it. I am 71 years old.